Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Please have a seat. I think we're not press here. Well, good evening, everyone. Before turning to the important work we accomplished here at the G7, I want to take a few minutes addressing the budget negotiations that I'm heading back home to deal with. Before I left for this trip, I met with all 4 congressional leaders, and we agreed the only way to move forward was in a bipartisan agreement. And I've done my part. We put forward a proposal to cut spending by more than $1 trillion, on top of the nearly $3 trillion in deficit reduction that I previously proposed through the combination of spending cuts and new revenues. Now it's time for the other side to move from their extreme positions, because much of what they've already proposed is simply, quite frankly, unacceptable. And so let me be clear. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects, for example, a $30 billion tax break for the oil industry, which made $200 billion last year. They don't need an incentive of another $30 billion, while putting health care of 21 million Americans at risk by going after Medicaid. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects $200 billion in excess payments for pharmaceutical industries and refusing to count that, while cutting over 100,000 school teachers and assistance jobs, 30,000 law enforcement officers, jobs cut across the entire United States of America. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects wealthy tax cheats and crypto traders while putting food assistance at risk for nearly 1 million Americans. It's time for Republicans to accept that there is no bipartisan deal to be made solely on their partisan terms. They have to move as well. All 4 congressional leaders agree with me that default is not, let me say it again, default is not an option. And I expect each of these leaders, to live up to that commitment. America has never defaulted on our debt, and it never will. The Speaker and I will be talking later on the plane as we head back, because it's 5 or 6, 7 o'clock in the morning there, and our teams are going to continue working. Now, we've had a packed few days here in Hiroshima, and I think with very productive and important meetings at the G7 summit. We also held the Quad meeting here in Hiroshima rather than Australia, and important bilateral discussions with Prime Minister Kishida of Japan, Prime Minister Albanese of Australia, and President Zelensky of Ukraine, as well as the Prime Minister of India. This is my 3rd trip to the Indo-Pacific as President, and I look forward to rescheduling my stops in Papua New Guinea and Australia later. I've spoken with the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, and Secretary Blinken is traveling there to meet with the Pacific Island partners at that moment. And I'm also going to be hosting, and I've spoken with the Prime Minister, hosting the leaders of the Pacific Island Forum in Washington this fall, because I've been unable to make it to Papua New Guinea. And Prime Minister Albanese, we're going to have a state visit later this year. And I also want to thank President Kishida for his outstanding, and it's not hyperbole, his outstanding leadership of the G7 this year, as well as Mrs. Kishida and the entire Japanese government for the hospitality they've shown to Jill, myself, and our whole team. Being in this city and visiting the memorial on Friday was a powerful reminder of the devastating reality of nuclear war and our shared responsibility to never cease our efforts to build for peace. And together with the leaders of the G7, we have reiterated our commitment to continue to work toward a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Over the past few days have showcased the unity of purpose among the G7. It's a very different organization than it was 5, 7, 10 years ago, because we're addressing the challenges that matter most to the world. We're united in our efforts to strengthen global health security. And yesterday I announced that the United States plans to contribute another $250 million to to the Pandemic Fund at the World Bank to make sure the world is better prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to future pandemics. We're united in our commitment to climate action and accelerating the transition to a global clean energy economy by investing in the industries of the future. We're united in our push to build a more resilient and inclusive global economy that can better withstand the kinds of shocks that we've experienced over the last few years, including by building a more secure and more diversified supply chain. Through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which we launched last year at the G7 summit in Germany, we've addressed the infrastructure needs that are holding back too many low and moderate income countries, particularly in the global south. The United States has already mobilized more than $30 billion in PGII projects around the globe, a significant step toward our collective pledge of the G7 to mobilize $600 billion in investment by 2027. And we resolved to reform the multilateral development banks to give them more flexibility and better able to fight poverty by helping respond to global challenges. Now, we're also united in our approach to the People's Republic of China. And the joint statement released yesterday outlines the shared principles we've all agreed to at the G7 and beyond in dealing with China. We're not looking to decouple from China. We're looking to de-risk and diversify our relationship with China. That means taking steps to diversify our supply chains, and we're not dependent on any one country for necessary product. It means resisting economic coercion together and countering harmful practices that hurt our workers. It means protecting a narrow set of advanced technologies critical for our national security. And those elements are all agreed on by the G7. Finally, joined here in Hiroshima by President Zelensky, and the G7 reaffirmed our shared and unwavering, let me say it again, our shared and unwavering commitment to stand with the brave people of Ukraine as they defend themselves against Russia's brutal war of aggression and the war crimes being committed. Together with our partner countries, we reiterated the need for a just peace that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, both core principles of the UN Charter. Russia started this war, and Russia could end it today by withdrawing its troops from Ukraine, internationally recognized borders, and ceasing its assault. Until then, Ukraine's ability to defend itself is essential to being able to end this war permanently and through diplomacy. You know, and this morning, I once more shared and assured President Zelensky, together with all G7 members and our allies and partners around the world, that we will not waver. Putin will not break our resolve as he thought he could 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago. We're going to continue to provide economic, humanitarian, and security assistance to Ukraine so it can stand strong as long as it needs it. And today, the United States announced our latest tranche of artillery, ammunition, anti-tank weapons, and bridging equipment to help Ukraine succeed in the battlefield. You know, in my private meeting with President Zelensky after the G7 meeting and with his staff, I told him the United States, together with our allies and partners, is going to begin training Ukrainian pilots in fourth-generation fighter aircraft, including F-16s, to strengthen Ukraine's Air Force as part of a long-term commitment to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. We provided the last year all that they needed to deal with what they were dealing with at the moment. And that's when now we're moving in the direction of putting them in a position to be able to defend themselves in ways beyond what they've had to deal with so far. The past few days have once more underscored how important America's global leadership is. Presumptuous thing for American president to say, but I think you'll find if you ask any of our colleagues it's true. The security and prosperity of the American people are substantially increased by working in concert with our closest allies and partners to build a future of greater economic strength and resilience in a world that is more peaceful and stable. And on many of these issues that matter to the American people, accelerating our clean energy transition, preventing another pandemic, dealing with China, standing up for Ukraine, the meetings I've had with my fellow G7 leaders have left us more united, more resolved, and more determined to set up for the greater progress in the months ahead. And this has been an extremely significant and important summit. With that, I'm going to take some questions. And Trevor of Reuters.
You spoke a moment ago about what you won't do in terms of your negotiations with Republicans, but I'm interested in what you've signaled you already might do. In particular, by conceding in these negotiations to some form of a cap or freezing spending, are you concerned that Mr. McCarthy has already forced you into accepting a policy position that could tip this economy into a recession?
No, I don't believe that's the case at all. As a matter of fact, I think that we can reach an agreement. As I've told you, and you may be aware, you've seen it, we have provided for a proposal that would cut $1 trillion off the baseline spent from the year before by just agreeing to deal with what was initially offered. And secondly, we're in a situation where let me put it this way. If you all were doing your budget at home and you said, okay, we have to make some cuts, would you only look at the spending? Or would you also look at your income? What was coming in the door to determine what you could afford? And so part of what I've been arguing from the beginning is a need to consider the tax structure as well as cutting spending. I'm willing to cut spending, and I proposed cuts in spending of over $1 trillion. But I believe we have to also look at the tax revenues. The idea that my Republican colleagues want to continue the $2 trillion tax cut that had profound negative impacts on the economy from the Trump administration, the fact that we've provided for the number, we got a lot of input from serious economists and former administration officials in both parties that we need more people who are qualified to be able to look at the tax returns of the 1,000 billionaires in America. Very complicated stuff. It's estimated that if we had the appropriate number of tax personnel, that we would save somewhere between, we would generate somewhere between $200 billion and $400 billion in tax revenue. And there's a lot of other, for example, the idea that we're, in terms of taxes, that they refuse to, for example, I was able to balance the budget and pass everything from the global warming bill. Anyway, I was able to cut by $1.7 billion in the first 2 years the deficit that we were accumulating. And because I was able to say to it that the 55 corporations in America that made $400 billion, or $400 billion, that they paid zero in tax, zero. And so we said, you got to pay a minimum of 15% taxes. What a horrible thing. You're paying more than 15% in taxes, every one of you out there. And so guess what? We not only balanced the budget, we were able to reduce the deficit by $1.7 billion. And so there's a lot of things that they refuse to look at in terms of tax generation, as well as what kind of people we're going to increase taxes for. Like I said, we're now down to, we went from roughly 740 billionaires to about 1,000 billionaires in America. They're paying an average tax rate of 8%. Raise your hand if you want to pay 8% only. I think you'd all be ready to do that. So my point is that there's a lot of things that they refuse to entertain, and they just said revenue is off the table. Well, revenue's not off the table. And so that's what we continue to have a significant disagreement on the revenue side.
But you don't think the spending cuts themselves will cause a recession?
I know they won't. I know they won't. Matter of fact, the fact that we were able to cut government spending by $1.7 trillion, that didn't cause a recession, that caused growth. Look, we have the lowest unemployment rate in over 50 years. We've created 7 million new jobs, including 800,000 manufacturing jobs. We have moved in a direction where we're rebuilding and reconstructing America through the Infrastructure Act. Look, here's the other thing. I'm not sure, my guess is I'll get a question about, well, wait a minute, the American people aren't satisfied. Well, guess what? As I told you all before, most of this, what we passed, doesn't kick in, it only kicks in over time. And so the fact is, for example, that if you're in a situation where I'll give you the one example that I've used, everybody understands the easiest, is insulin. Well, I decided that we were going to be in a position where we were not going to continue to pay the highest drug prices in the world. That's what we do, by the way. Same manufacturer of a drug in the United States, selling it here in Japan, selling it in Tokyo, or selling it in Berlin, or selling it around the world, they pay a lot less than we pay at home. So we said a simple proposition. Let's take a look at how much it costs to make the product. And I'm not going to ask you to show of hands like you're doing at a town meeting, but if I usually ask how many people know somebody who has type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and almost at least half the audience raises their hand. Well, they were paying somewhere between $400 and $700 a month for their insulin that they badly need to stay healthy and alive. Well, guess what? It costs $10, T-E-N, $10 to make. To package, total amount, you could argue maybe as much as $13. Well, guess what? Now they can't charge more for Medicare can't, because Medicare is taking American tax dollars and paying for the elderly's health care needs. You can't charge more than $35 for that drug. That saves $160 billion. Hear it? $160 billion less will be paid out by the American taxpayer to help the elderly people on Medicare with a problem. Well, a lot of this is just kicking in. We're in a situation where next year, for the drug costs, no senior will have to pay total cost of all the drugs, from expensive cancer drugs to whatever drugs they're taking, will not have to pay more than $3,500 a year. The following year, we've already passed this is a law now. The following year, they won't have to pay more than $2,000. That saves another $200 billion that we're paying out. But the other team won't count this. Even though it's a law, we passed it, they won't count that as reducing the debt. So there's a lot of those kinds of disagreements we have. And my guess is that I'm going to be talking to the Speaker of the House on the way back on the plane, because there'll be morning time over at home, and I'm going to be in that plane about an hour or so. And my guess is he's going to want to deal directly with me and making sure we're all on the same page. But that's probably more than you wanted to know. How about Macero, NHK?
Hi, good evening, Mr. President. The Chinese military is more active at this time in the Taiwan Strait, with expectations this might increase leading up to Taiwan's presidential election next January. Despite some diplomatic communication recently between the U.S. and China, the military hotline is not working. Under these circumstances, how will you manage the diplomatic relationship with China? And how will you strengthen the U.S. alliance with Japan and ROK in order to counter China? Thank you.
Well, number one, you're right. We should have an open hotline. At the Bali conference, that's what the President Xi and I agreed we were going to do and meet on. And then this silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spine equipment was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly. But in the meantime, what's happened is, I think it's fair to say, for those of you who have dealt with the Japanese government and reported from here for a long time, the situation in terms of our relations with Japan have never, ever, ever in American history been stronger. Never, never. And we started this relationship when I came to see, some of you were with me on my first trip here, when I came to see President Kishida's predecessor, and made the case that what's happening in Europe, the world's getting smaller. What's happening in Europe in the invasion of Ukraine affects everyone, including people here in the Pacific Basin. And so we've ended up where you have Japan stepping up in a way that's of real consequence in terms of your defense budget, number one, and a beginning of a rapprochement with South Korea. I've spoken at length with President Moon of South Korea. He came to Washington of late. He's agreed, we're all of the same agreement, that in fact we are not going to, we're maintaining, we all agree we're going to maintain the one China policy, which says, everybody kind of forgets, now I mean you all know, but the public kind of forgets that it says that neither country, China or Taiwan, neither territory can independently declare what they're going to do, period. There has to be a mutually agreed to outcome. And so we're sticking by that. We're not going to tell China what they can do. We made it clear that we don't expect Taiwan to independently declare independence either. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to put Taiwan in a position that they can defend themselves. And there is clear understanding among most of our allies that, in fact, if China were to act unilaterally, there would be a response. There would be a response. But so I don't think there's anything inevitable about the notion that there's going to be this conflict between the United States and the West and or Japan and Korea and the Quad. And if you take a look at what's happened, we are more secure with all the talk about China's building its military. It is building its military. And that's why I've made it clear that I am not going to I'm not prepared to trade certain items with China. And when I was asked by President Xi why, I said, because you're using them to build nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and I'm not going to do it. And we've now got commitment from all of our allies. They're not going to either provide that kind of material that allows them to do that. But that's not a hostile act. That's an act that says we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to maintain the status quo ante. And what's going on now is, look at the meeting we had here today and yesterday of the Quad. I bet you, maybe some of you thought it, but I doubt many people in this audience or any other audience would have said that 2 years after being elected, I'd be able to convince India, Australia, Japan, and the United States to form an organization called the Quad to maintain stability in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Well, when asked by the Prime Minister, by President Xi why we're doing that, I said, simple. We have an international organizations have agreed upon what constitutes open airspace and sea space. And we're not going to allow that to be unilaterally altered, period. We're not changing any rules. We're just making sure that we unite democracies in the conviction that the Pacific Basin remains what it was before, open and clear. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't guess what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is I think we're more united than we've ever been in the Pacific in terms of maintaining stability and maintaining a sense of security. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but I hope it does. If it doesn't, do you want to follow up with any portion of that question? Well, how about, if you don't want to follow, how about Anne Marie at Bloomberg, TV and radio?
Thank you, Mr. President. You just said, I'm willing to cut spending. Speaker McCarthy says that the U.S. government needs to spend less next year than they did this year. So will you agree to that? And on China, your team has been trying to secure meetings with their Chinese counterparts. Would you consider easing some sanctions to improve relations, like the sanctions that are currently on China's defense minister? Thank you.
Yes and no. No, I'm not going to ease the sanctions, but yes, I think we should. On the front end of your question is that there's a lot that is going on relative to spending. And we have agreed to cut spending. We've cut spending, and we're going to continue to cut spending. But the question is, what base do you start from? Initially, if you remember when the Republicans introduced when the Speaker, by I guess a 4 or 5 vote majority, was able to pass what he calls extending the debt with a limitation on what you had to do to expend it in terms of the budget side. I said, I'm not going to negotiate on whether you extend the debt. I will negotiate on the budget. On the budget side of the equation, they came along and said initially, it was hard to determine where they are, quite frankly. And I don't know, you all may know more from questioning than I do. But they came along and said, we're going to move off of the 2023 budget. And that's the baseline we're going to use for the next 2 years, that budget. And I said, well, what about what you all just voted on after the budget, which was the add-on money that you all agreed to, and the House and Senate voted for? And they said, well, that includes that as well. I said, okay, well, then we may be able to work on something. So we started calculating what that would mean in terms of it came to a 22% cut for everything in the budget, but the things that have already been passed, the 5 big initiatives that I've already passed in terms of infrastructure, the Affordable Care Act, et cetera. But in the meantime, what happened is that that seems to be changing. They said, well, we're going to exempt. Remember we said that, well, you're going to cut veterans because 20 said everything, that's discretionary budget. So no, we're not going to cut veterans. Okay, that's good. And initially they started off, they're going to cut Medicare, Medicaid. I said, whoa, 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 no, I mean not Medicaid, Social Security and Medicare. I said, no, 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 no. First time I ever had a negotiation in the State of the Union message. But they said, no, we're not going to cut that. Okay, well, that's off the radar. What else is off the radar? And they named some other things. And I said, well, that means if you want to get the number you wanted from freezing the budget at 2023 plus the additions you added, then that means you're going to go from 22%, you're going to end up cutting 30% or 35% discretionary budget. For example, if you calculate what they're talking about, they're going to lose 100,000 teachers and assistants. They're going to lose thousands of police officers across the board. I mean, just calculate what it means if you take all discretionary spending and you make no distinctions other than what the percentage number of the cut is. And some of it makes absolutely no sense at all. And so what we've done is we're going to have to sit down. I'm hoping that Speaker McCarthy is just waiting to negotiate with me when I get home, which has been, I don't know whether that's true or not, we'll find out. But at first we weren't making progress, then we made a lot of progress, and then all of a sudden we came back with a proposal that was very cut back from where they had agreed or discussed. And now I don't know where we gave a counter proposal to the counter again. I know this sounds ridiculous, but that's what we did. And I'm waiting to hear the response to what we have offered. We are willing to cut spending as well as raise revenue so people start paying their fair share. Again, if this were a town meeting, and ask, raise your hand if you think the tax structure is fair, remotely fair. What do you think? Anyway, so that's the context.
And on China, you will not lift sanctions on China's defense minister. His boy also is trying to weaken him, but he's currently sanctioned by the U.S. government.
No, I know that. That's under negotiation right now. I thought you said whether I would lift sanctions on material I was going to sell the Defense Department, meaning would I sell some? The answer, that's under discussion. Jim Tankersley, New York Times.
Hi, Mr. President, thank you.
Oh.
You speak a lot at these summits about the power of democracies to solve big problems, but I'm curious in these meetings with world leaders, how are you explaining the possibility that American democracy could cause a global financial crisis if the debt limit is breached next month? And I'm wondering if you are offering them assurances that whether it's by invoking the 14th Amendment or anything else, you will take whatever steps you need to make sure that doesn't happen.
First of all, it would be a very serious circumstance if we didn't pay our debt for the first time in 230 years. That'd be a serious problem. So far, there's been very little discussion, and they all know what's going on, about whether or not we're going to default on our debt. Number two. Number three, I can't guarantee that they wouldn't force a default by doing something outrageous. I can't guarantee that. Number four, I'm looking at the 14th Amendment as to whether or not we have the authority. I think we have the authority. The question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed and as a consequence past the date in question and still default on the debt? That's a question that I think is unresolved. And so the point is, I'm hoping and I believe that when we sat in the room with all the leaders from Mitch McConnell on, and they said, we will not default, period. We will not default. That's what all, including Kevin McCarthy, said, we will not default. And so I'm assuming that we mean what we say, and we'll figure out a way to not have to default. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News.
Good afternoon,
Hey.
Mr. President. What has President Zelensky told you about the big counteroffensive? And maybe you can start by telling us whether it's actually underway or not. And I'd like to ask you about the F-16s. You've greenlit them now. Jake Sullivan said arms and equipment go to Ukraine according to what he called the exigencies of the conflict. So what exigency now exists that didn't exist that demands these planes?
Well, I'll tell you exactly when they're going to move, exactly where they're going to go. He told me, come on, God love you. I'm going to, even if I knew precisely, you think I'm going to tell you what they're going to do in terms of their offensive? Well, I hope you hope I wouldn't do that, because that would mean it wouldn't succeed. But the fact is that we did discuss privately with Zelensky. I did discuss with Zelensky how, let me put it this way. We and our NATO allies know how many brigades they have trained, know what the status of those brigades are, and have an expectation as to what their likelihood of succeeding are. We don't know that for certain. War is uncertain. War is uncertain, to state the obvious. So, and it will proceed. I can't, even if I think I do know, but I'm not going to tell you because that would not be a smart thing to do either. So having said that, the expectation and hope is that they will be successful in that it'll make it clear to Russia that the cost, for example, Bakhmut. Bakhmut is a discussion about whether or not it's been lost or whatever. And well, the truth of the matter is the Russians have suffered over 100,000 casualties in Bakhmut. It's hard to make up. It's hard to make up. So whether or not there are troops in Bakhmut occupying, there's not many buildings left standing in Bakhmut. It's a pretty devastated city. But they have been able to move in a direction that they've been able to lock down an awful lot of the Russian forces, including the Wagner group. So with regard to the F-16s, F-16s would not have helped in that regard at all. It was unnecessary. For example, let's take just Bakhmut, for example. Would not have any additional added consequence. But what's happened is, since the provision of everything from the significant missile defense systems, tanks, sophisticated tanks, and like all the things that were of consequence in the near term in the Donbass area and where the fighting was taking place, they now have all that equipment. There's a little bit still coming, but have all that equipment. What's going to happen, though, is if they continue to do well, they're going to be in a situation where you're going to have the Russians being able to stand off at a greater distance from maintaining their headquarters and other things which are out of range of certain of the existing capacity they have. And they have to be able to be in a position where now those fighter jets, those F-16s, make a big difference in terms of being able to deal with what is coming down the road. And God willing, and we don't know this, if they're successful and there ends up being an accommodation where there is not a ceasefire, but there is a peace agreement that gets worked out, that they'll have the capacity to have confidence in their ability to resist response by the Russians if they were to change their position. So that's the essence of the difference. Was there another part of the question?
No, but I have one, and that is, you expect these F-16s to take part in this conflict?
No, not the percent. I don't expect the F-16s to take part in the existing. Let's assume that it's not, but let's assume tomorrow the offensive was started, or in a week or 2 or 5 or 7 or 10. It's not highly unlikely they would take place in that context, but it will take place in the context if they're successful in the near term. They're going to then continue to have to fight with the Russians who have headquarters beyond where they are now not able to reach by the existing capacity that exists in their arsenal. So it's a different need, just like the tanks weren't needed in the beginning, but they're needed now. And so that's the nature of the change.
What assurances do you have that providing F-16s won't escalate this war?
I have a flat assurance from Zelensky that they will not use it to go on and move into Russian geographic territory. But wherever Russian troops are within Ukraine and the area, they would be able to do that. Thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it. It is for them.
And Mr. President, on the debt limit, you said already, I've done my part. Do you think that if there is a breach, nobody is going to blame you?
Of course, no one will blame me. I know you won't. You'll be saying Biden did a wonderful job. I know you.
Would you be blameless in a default situation?
On the merits, based on what I've offered, I would be blameless. On the politics of it, no one will be blameless. And by the way, that's one of the things that some are contemplating. I actually had, well, I got to be careful here. I think there are some MAGA Republicans in the House who know the damage that it would do to the economy. And because I am president and president's responsible for everything, Biden would take the blame, and that's the one way to make sure Biden's not reelected. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
We have not come up with a unilateral action that could succeed in a matter of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. That's the issue. So it's up to lawmakers. But my hope and intention is when we resolve this problem, I find a rationale to take it to the courts to see whether or not the 14th Amendment is in fact something that would be able to stop it. Thank you.
The press conference has concluded. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everyone.
Don't have simple questions anymore, as well as we don't have simple answers, because we have a very complicated neighbor who is a criminal, a terrorist, a complicated enemy. But we are keeping on, we are fighting thanks to the courage of our people, our warriors, and thanks to our cleverness. We are not throwing people to die. For us, the people are the treasure. This is the most important thing that we have. And there are no misunderstandings. I clearly understand what is taking place in Bakhmut, and we all clearly understand why all of that is taking place. I cannot share with you the tactical views of our military, of our warriors, but as of today we can see that the country, which dozens times is bigger than we are, can cannot occupy us, cannot win in this war. And we understand that a bit more and then we will be prevailing. And that is why we are acting how we are acting, valuing lives of the people. The hardest is when if Bakhmut had some military tactical mistake, for instance, and people could be surrounded, then all the military know what could happen. How we could create the situation for people not to be captured. Now our people are accomplishing a very important mission. They are now in Bakhmut. I will not share where exactly, but it witnesses that Bakhmut is not occupied by Russian Federation as of today. There are no 2 or 3 interpretations of those words. Thank you for the question.
Dear colleagues, let me remind you once again, we are taking questions not by raising hands, but by standing up to microphones to the left and to the right from the hall. And the second question is from Voice of America, Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Misha Komodovsky, White House correspondent. I'm going to switch to Ukrainian, if you don't mind. Пане президенте, останнього разу, коли я бачив вас, ви були в овальному кабінеті Білого Дому, і саме тоді вирішилося питання передачі Україні систем Patriot. Тепер ви у Хіросімі, і ми бачимо, що ухвалене рішення серед союзників про тренування українських пілотів. Чи означає це, що питання передачі F-15 і F-16 Україні вирішено, і коли ці літаки з'являться в Україні?
Dякую. For a long time politically with our partners to get the desired outcome of the strengthening of our skies. Besides air defense, we are grateful for that. We are really grateful to the United States of America as the leaders, as for the support in this sphere, and other partners of ours. And besides air defense systems of different formats, you know that this is the global system. We are not speaking about Patriots. We are also grateful for Hawks, Crotals. We are grateful for IRIS-T powerful package. We are grateful for NASAMS, and it's really a huge number, which is not enough as of today to protect our skies, but still part of it should be in this Western format as the aircraft, and that is why we have been working on the air, and it is so important for us to have the open mission of training. This is the first step. Further on, we have several months for the training of our pilots, and we will be working for these people to be as educated as possible, as trained and experienced as possible, with huge experience, to decrease this process of training, to make it shorter, and for them to appear to strengthen our state, especially the air defense strengthening. I cannot now tell you how many aircrafts will be able to get. I cannot tell you definitely when it takes place, but we will speed it up because it's important for us every day. We are losing people's lives. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ваше запитання, будь ласка.
Your question, please.
Hello, Mr. Zelensky. Mackenzie Gray with Global News from Canada. Today you met with Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister. He didn't announce any new weapons or aid. Are you satisfied with the support that Canada's been giving to Ukraine in the last number of months?
I would like you to understand, we have powerful relations with Canada. There are some of the points which maybe publicly cannot be commented. So far, we don't have anything to make public. We are working on something, but Canada is supporting us. We are speaking today with a powerful block of demining equipment. You know, this is about the hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, because Russia is not just an enemy. They are acting not like an enemy, but as a terrorist. They mined our fields, and these are really hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And here, the help of one country wouldn't be sufficient enough. That is why we are saying that Canada supported us with this package. Moreover, now we have the beginning of the delivery of the certain equipment from Canadian side. It has already taken place.
Ваше запитання, будь
Your
ласка.
question,
Це
please.
Bloomberg, так?
Bloomberg, right?
Yes, thank you. Mr. President, Rosalind Matheson from Bloomberg in London. I wanted to ask you, you've met many leaders here while you've been at the G7, but one leader you're not seeing is the Brazilian President Lula. I wanted to know why that's not happening. And the reason I'm asking is because Russia is the aggressor in this war. As you said, you hope that they are the last aggressors, and yet even some of the leaders here, it seems, don't see that as clearly as you do? And why is that? And how can we do more to stop countries like Brazil, India, and China sending sources of hard cash to Russia? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, we don't have any proof and evidence that Brazil, China, or India are sending any weapons to Russia. Though I will be frank with you, I was in touch with certain leaders not to have any steps from their side. And this is the first point. Secondly, it's so important for us to be united together, to get together. This is a very important sign and a step, and that is very important for us as a task to involve everyone in the peace formula, which is based upon our experience and our proposals, which I have presented at G20 summit in Indonesia last year. Some time past, we were working very well, and today we need to involve as many countries as possible for the first founding summit. I think it would be a very important political pressure onto aggressor, and that is why this was well, what we paid attention to and paid time to these conversations. As for the situation with my meetings, I met everyone, almost everyone, all the leaders, and all of them have their own schedules, so I think that is why we couldn't meet with the Brazilian president.
I'm sorry, but are you disappointed that you couldn't get time with Lula? Is it disappointing for you?
I think it disappointed him.
Дякую. Наступне запитання в кінці
залу.
Thank you.
The next question in the back.
広島のテレビ局 RCC です。今回広島に来られてですね、原爆資料館ご覧になったわけですけれども、その原爆資料館の中で印象に残った資料などありましたら教えていただきたいと思います。もう一点はですね、広島の被爆者の方の中には、ゼレンスキー大統領にとって、今回のサミットに参加することで、国を守るための兵器などの支援を要請することも大事なのかもしれないが、せっかく被爆地広島を訪れているんだから、もっと戦争を終わらせるための和平に向けて話し合いをした方がいいのではないかと、広島で行われるサミットで違和感があるという声があります。その声にどう答えますか。
We understand that you're asking about the weapons, but not all of the people in Japan, especially here in Hiroshima, are supporting this idea. Maybe you should speak more in Hiroshima about negotiations for peace. Thank you for the question. I think that in fact what has taken place in Hiroshima and the ruins which are taking place in our country historically, well, it wouldn't be fair to compare, though I would tell you sincerely today, and there was the first question about Bakhmut, by the way, so let me tell you. Let me be sincere that the pictures of ruined Hiroshima really remind me, totally remind me, Bakhmut and other similar settlements and towns. Just the same, nothing alive left. All of the buildings have been ruined. There is no understanding where the street is, where the house used to be. This is just a total destroyed area. Nothing left. Not a single person left. And what's the comparison, as you say, and symbolism? Let me tell. We can see where we are now at. This is the modern city today, which looks alive. What's important with the respect of the people to the values. And these are the pictures of the tragedies of Hiroshima and what we can see today. So I consider that the same will take place in Bakhmut and other our cities and settlements and villages and so on. Definitely it will be like that. Unfortunately today it's a tragedy, but in the future there will be reconstruction and recovery. So when you say that we are asking about something, I still consider that this is not correct, it's not appropriate, we are not asking. I would like to thank you, superiors.
нас запрошують,
We are being
і це
invited.
спільне
And
бачення
this is the
миру
common vision of
майбутнього,
the peace of
це
the
спільна
future. This is
відбудова,
the
тому
common
що Україна
recovery and
захищає
reconstruction because
спільні
Ukraine is
цінності.
protecting common
У нас
values.
зруйновані
We have
тисячі
ruined and
квадратних
destroyed
кілометрів.
thousands
Це
of square
просто
kilometers.
жах.
This is just horror.
Донбас, на який
Donbass,
прийшов президент Путін,
where President Putin came
кажучи
to,
всім і налаштовуючи
telling
світ, і
everyone
деякі ті
and
держави, про які
providing
сьогодні
the ideas for some
говорила
of the
пані
states which
журналістка,
were mentioned by
і
Ms.
налаштовуючи, що
Journalist
він
before,
зберігає життя
saying and
рускоязичним
emphasizing as if
людям,
he's saving
так
lives of the
ось весь
Russian-speaking people.
Донбас,
The
де
whole
були
Donbass,
багато
where there
рускоязичних
were
людей,
lots of
ось він так
Russian-speaking people.
виглядає
This is
на
how it
сьогодні,
looks
на
like
жаль,
now,
так трагічно,
unfortunately.
як
This is the
раніше
tragic
виглядала
thing,
Хіросіма.
how Hiroshima used to look
Правий
like.
мікрофон, запитання, будь
The
ласка.
right microphone, the
Thank you
question,
very much,
please.
President Zelensky. I am from domestic media called MBS. I would like to ask you, you've just visited Atomic Bomb Museum and this evening right next to this building. Was there any specific exhibition that still stay in your mind or in your memory that you want to share when you go back to Ukraine? And also, what does nuclear mean to you right now?
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for the question.
Ви знаєте,
Well, you know,
там дійсно
it is really,
багато трагічних
there are
фотографій.
lots of tragic pictures in the museum.
Діти,
The children,
діти, маленькі
little
діточки
babies,
перед загибелью.
before their demise, before their death, and we have similar pictures, unfortunately. Only tears are in my eyes. This is just a tragedy. How the people are capable to do something like that, especially with the children. How can you do that to the children? Honestly speaking, I don't understand that. I don't have for that adequate diagnosis. I cannot understand this disease. That is why I'm not a doctor to understand the sick Russians who are having such attitude towards us, and the tragedy which I saw on your pictures, all of that is really very similar. And in my speech I was speaking about the shadow. I said that not in vain, because I could see the picture where there was only a shadow left of a human being who was just sitting and nothing was left. Only the fully incinerated life. This is the tragedy itself. So I decided to speak about that in the speech. The shadow which Putin wanted our country to look like. I found such an association. I do apologize for that. But this is my impression.
Праворуч в кінці запитання.
The microphone to the right in the rear, please.
Mr. Zelensky, I'm Tessa Wong from BBC News. I have 3 questions for you. I hope you don't mind me asking you. Number 1 is, what kind of weapons deals have you secured at the G7 summit, and who gave you what? Number 2 is, how confident will you get your F-16s, since no countries have promised them to you yet? Number 3 is, when will your counteroffensive happen? What conditions need to be fulfilled before you decide to launch it?
Я не впевнений, що я вам дам.
I'm not sure I will answer the 3 questions.
По-перше, яка зброя?
First of all, which weapons?
Sorry, for the first question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit tired.
Sorry.
Yeah, the first was about the weapon, yes?
The first is, what kind of weapons deals have you secured at the G7 summit from the people that you have met? And who will give you what?
Зброя якісна.
The weapons of high quality,
Нададуть всі.
it will be provided by everyone.
How confident will you get your F-16s, since no countries have
Ми
promised?
будемо працювати над
We
цим.
will
Я
be
впевнений,
working
тому
on
що
that,
у нас
I'm
є
sure,
вже
because we
розуміння,
already
з
have
якими
the
державами
understanding
працюємо.
which
Ми
states we are
працювали ще
working
до
with.
того, як
We have been working before.
у нас розблокувався механізм
Deblocked
навчання на
mechanisms of the
F-16,
training.
тобто у нас будуть літаки. Я не можу поки що вам сказати, скільки, це не секрет.
I
Я
cannot
дійсно
tell you how
цього
many.
не
This is
знаю.
not a
Що
secret. I really
стосується
don't
зброї,
know.
про деяку
But as
не
for
хочу
the weapons,
говорити,
I wouldn't
але
like to
поки
mention
що,
some
тому
of
що
that,
її
but
просто
so
немає.
far, because we just don't have it.
Але все
So
одно
far,
питання, як
still,
завжди,
the question is
глобальне
also
питання
very
артилерії.
global.
Що
Artillery. There should be
стосується третього
artillery. As
запитання
for your
вашого
third
щодо
question, as for
контрнаступу,
the
вибачте, будь
counteroffensive,
ласка,
I do
всі ваші
apologize.
запитання
All of
такі,
your
що я
questions
повинен
are of
відповідати
such a
на них
character, that are
поки
not such
що
a
дуже
nature,
загально.
that I need to answer in a very common
Росія
manner.
відчує, коли буде
Russian will feel when we'll have a counteroffensive.
Дякую, шановні колеги.
Thank
Нагадую,
you,
по
dear
одному
colleagues. I do
запитанню.
remind
Давайте
you one
поважати
question
всіх
each, please.
інших.
Let us respect all the rest
Зліва
of the
запитання.
journalists. The question from the left, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hugh Remington from Channel 10 in Australia. You met two leaders of major democratic nations who are not members of the G7, India and Australia. Can you tell us what you felt you got from your conversations with Mr. Modi? And Mr. Albanese of Australia has said that he doesn't rule out offering more support to Ukraine, but wants to do so in negotiations with your government. Did you have any discussions about anything new that Australia might do?
We are working with Australia, that is true. I cannot disclose any details. We had certain deliveries. We are grateful for those packages of support. We had a very nice meeting, the visit to Kiev, and I'm really grateful for that. And in fact, the visits of all of the leaders who are not afraid to come to us during the war, that is very respectful. As of Australia, India, the countries which do not belong to G7, for us the most important thing, just understand me, we don't have accidental meetings. I cannot afford myself to have accidental meetings because we are at war. I don't have time for that really. So we were in Saudi Arabia before. We are working to involve the maximum amount of countries, number of countries with totally different continents, to involve all of them into diplomatic pressure onto Russia through the peace formula which is offered by Ukraine. This is why all of those meetings are important for us. Not only to be insisting as for the participants in the summit, no, but to be understood, comprehensible, because sometimes we understand that it is very hard to fight against narratives of the informational war which Russia waged many years before it waged the full-scale invasion into Ukraine. In informational sphere, it prevailed for many years in different continents and different countries. So I think that even some of the countries don't understand that they lost information war. And we are out of time, in fact, for speaking about these details. That is, whatever we can do today is to correct the situation, to make it appropriate, and we need to speak about that, mentioning the facts and to show it here. I'm grateful to you as the representatives of the journalist community that you are showing and informing people, you are saying the truth. Some of the states need this truth to be more frequent. Thank you. Please, from the RAB.
Good evening, President Zelensky. Thank you very much for your speech. My name is Kathleen Benoza, and I'm from the Japan Times. So my first question would be, with your surprise visit, all eyes are now on Ukraine, and some say this takes attention away from Hiroshima and nuclear disarmament. What do you think about that?
My participance is not a surprise. I was invited to take part in the meeting of G7, but my participation could be online. The visit offline is unexpected because of the security reasons, and because besides G7, the summit also involved other countries besides G7, which are very important to have meetings with Ukraine. Some of our conversations were really the discussions of the matters about Ukraine and other complicated situations in the world. But we paid most attention to the war in Ukraine. I consider that I need to be here. I would like to thank the states which helped us during all these times to deblock some of the issues beforehand. We understood that I need to come here personally, and then we'll have the certain outcome. I'm grateful for that we found such an opportunity to be here and to deblock some of the issues that are so important. Two more questions, please, and we will need to conclude. To the right, please.
President Zelensky, thank you so much for taking our questions. I'm Motoko Rich with the New York Times. You mentioned diplomatic pressure, but given the inefficacy of this diplomatic pressure so far on Russia, do you want countries like Japan, our host today, and South Korea to actually send lethal weapons to support the war in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question.
повинні з вами розуміти.
We need to understand.
Сьогодні це була, напевне, головна
Today,
теза. Я
maybe this was
дуже
my
радий,
main
що
point, and I'm so happy.
я не знаю, чи всі були
Well, I
за,
don't know whether
але
everybody
точно ніхто
was
не був
agreeing with me, but
Це дуже
definitely there
важливий
was no
момент
one who
щодо
disagreed.
дипломатичного
This
тиску
is a
на
very
Росію
important
і щодо
point as for the
тих чи
diplomatic
інших
pressure onto Russia,
форматів
and these are
дипломатичного
those
вирішення
formats of diplomatic
війни,
solution of the war,
яка відбувається в
which is
Україні.
taking place in
Головне – це
Ukraine.
повага
The
до
most important
статуту
to have
ООН,
the
до
respect
міжнародного
to the
права.
UN
І
Charter
Росії
and
немає
the
шансу
international
до
law.
жодних
Russia
дипломатичних шляхів,
doesn't have
поки її
any
війська
chance to
знаходяться
have
з
any
порушенням
diplomatic
нашої
ways while
територіальної
their
цілісності
troops
і
are
суверенітету,
located on
порушенням
our
всіх
territory,
законів
violating
міжнародного
our
права,
territorial
знаходяться
integrity
на
and
нашій
sovereignty,
території. І для мене дуже
violating
важливо,
all the
це є
international laws.
дипломатичне
For me, it is very
важливе
important.
розблокування
This is the
і
diplomatic
розуміння, що
deblocking
всі
and
ми розуміємо,
understanding.
що
We
поки
all
війська
understand
Росії
that while
знаходяться
the
на
Russian
території
troops
України,
are on the
вони
territory
із
of
ними
Ukraine,
ніхто ніяких
no
справ не
one
буде
will
мати.
deal
Це
with them
дуже
at
важливо.
all. That is
Далі,
so
що
important.
стосується інших
Further on,
кроків,
as
це
for
відповідно
other
формула
steps,
миру.
this is the
Там
peace
є
formula, and
багато
there we have
криз, і
lots of
зрозуміло,
crises
як
and
їх
points
розв'язувати, ці
described,
кризи,
and it is
щодо
obvious how we can solve
продовольчої
those crises
безпеки,
as for
щодо
food security,
ядерної
as for
безпеки,
the nuclear
повернення наших
security,
діточок
and bringing
депортованих.
back our
20
deported
тисяч, це
children.
зафіксовано
20,000 of
офіційно,
children
але ми не
is
знаємо,
what
скільки
officially
реально
documented, but we
дітей
don't
вкрала
really
Росія.
know the real
Таких
number
криз
of
багато.
abducted
Їх
children.
в одній державі,
There are
ну,
lots of
складно
crises.
розв'язати,
It is very
якщо
hard
чесно.
to solve
І
those
тут
crises
я
if we are alone.
задоволений тим,
So that
що
is
я
why I'm
почув
so happy that I
підтримку
heard about the
від
support
держав,
from the states
членів
who are the
сьогоднішнього
G7
засідання.
and not only
Також, що
G7
стосується
members of
тепер
the today's
зброї.
meeting.
Да, я
Now
б дуже
about the
хотів,
weapons, yes, I would really
щоб
like
всі
that.
держави,
I
які
would like
спроможні
all of the
нам
states
дати
which are
допомогу,
capable to provide
щоб вони
help
нам
to us,
допомогли.
for
Але я
them to help.
розумію,
But
що
I
є
understand that
відповідні
there are certain
законодавчі або
legislative
конституційні
or
складнощі.
constitutional complications.
Останнє запитання
The
ваше,
last
будь ласка.
question, please, from here
Ліворуч, ваше
to the
запитання.
left. Your question, please.
日本のテレビ局テレビ東京の横堀と言います。今日はありがとうございます。ウクライナ国内が大変な状況の中でゼレンスキー大統領日本まで来られたわけですけれども、
Thank you, Mr. President, for
日
your
本に
visit
最も期
in
待する
spite
役
of
割、
such
日
a
本に今後
complicated
求めたいことは
situation
どんな
in
ことでしょうか。
Ukraine. What are you expecting most of all from Japan in the future?
Дякую.
Thank
У
you.
нас з прем'єр-міністром
With
і
the
з
Prime
його
Minister
урядом
and with
було
his government,
дві зустрічі.
we had two meetings.
Було кілька розмов.
There were several
Перш за
conversations.
все,
First
чесно
of
вам
all,
скажу,
let me be
технології.
honest, the
Чому?
technologies.
Тому що дійсно
Why?
для нас
Well,
відбудова
because
України –
the
це
recovery of
сигнал для
Ukraine
всіх
would
наших
be the
людей,
signal
сигнал,
for all
що
of our
життя
people, the
продовжується.
sign that the
Це
life
дуже
is
важливо.
going
Вона є
on. This is
як
so
швидка
important,
відбудова, fast
both
recovery
about
plan,
fast
так і
recovery
глобальна
plan
відбудова.
and also the
Ми
global
відбудовувати будемо
recovery.
Україну
We
з
will
новими
recover Ukraine with the new
від енергетики
technologies
до медицини.
from
І
energy
тут,
to
а вже ж досвід
healthcare. And
Японії для
here
нас
the
дуже
experience of
важливий.
Japan
Сьогодні
is
ми
so
проходили
important for
по
us.
цим
Today we were
напрямкам з
going through
прем'єр-міністром.
those
І є
spheres with the
повне
Prime Minister. We
розуміння,
have
і
full
є
understanding.
кілька
We have several spheres to deal with. Energy sphere, especially green energy, the railway, which is so important for us, where we would need the Japanese modern technologies, healthcare, and so on. But I think that all of that is ahead of us, and all of that will have positive
Шановні
outcome,
колеги,
I'm
дякую
sure.
за
Dear colleagues,
запитання.
I thank you
Час
for the
для
questions.
прес-конференції
Unfortunately,
сплив.
this
Дякую
is,
всім.
we're out of the time for the press
Thank you so much.
conference.
Дуже дякую. До побачення.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.